You are at an age where the culture has begun to treat you as someone in decline. The professional world moves faster than it did. The cultural references belong to people younger than you. The body that carried you through the first half of your life is filing its complaints. And underneath the practical adjustments, a question is forming that the culture has almost no honest language for. What is this time actually for? Not what should I still be accomplishing, what is the genuine value, the unreplaceable, available only now value of the decades that lie ahead? Cicero answered this question at 62 in 44 BC while watching everything he had spent his life building collapse around him. His republic was dead. Julius Caesar had been assassinated, but the wars that followed were worse. His daughter, Tullia, whom he loved more than anyone, had just died. He had been politically marginalized by men who would eventually have him killed. And in the middle of it all, he sat down and wrote De Senectute, on old age, one of the most clear-eyed, philosophically serious, and unexpectedly cheerful accounts of aging in the Western tradition. Not because his life was going well, because he had decided that the argument needed to be made, and he was the person to make it. There is a particular failure of the cultural imagination around aging that most people do not notice until they're inside it. The culture has two stories about growing older. The first is decline, the gradual subtraction of capacity, relevance, and vitality that ends in invisibility and death. The second is the corrective, the inspiration narrative of the person who refuses to slow down, who proves the decline story wrong by running marathons at 70 and launching startups at 65. Both stories are organized around the same assumption that the value of the later decades is measured against the standard of the earlier ones, that what matters is whether you can still do what you once could. Cicero rejected this framework entirely. He did not argue that old age is as productive as youth. He argued that it is valuable for completely different reasons, reasons that youth cannot access, that middle age can only glimpse, and that the later decades make fully available for the first time. He was not consoling himself. He was making a philosophical argument that the grief of decline is real and that it is also, in an important sense, beside the point. Marcus Tullius Cicero was born in 106 BC in Arpinum, a hill town southeast of Rome, into a family of the equestrian class, wealthy enough for education, not patrician enough for automatic advancement. He made himself through his mind. He studied law, rhetoric, and philosophy with an intensity that was, by the standards of his time and any other, extraordinary. He traveled to Greece and Asia Minor to study under the best teachers available. He returned to Rome and built, through the force of his oratory and legal skill, a career that took him to the consulship, the highest office of the Roman Republic, in 63 BC. As consul, he suppressed the Catilinarian conspiracy, a plot to overthrow the republic by a group of indebted aristocrats. He executed the conspirators without trial and was celebrated as the savior of Rome. He was also, for this same act, later prosecuted and driven into exile for 18 months. He returned. He navigated the wars between Caesar and Pompey with the specific, exhausting difficulty of a man who had strong principles and weak political options. He sided with Pompey's faction. Caesar won. Caesar was gracious to him. Caesar was assassinated in March of 44 BC. Cicero was 62. His daughter, Tullia, died in February of 45 BC, the loss that broke him more than anything that politics had done. He buried himself in philosophy. In the 18 months between Tullia's death and his own, he produced a body of philosophical work of stunning scope and quality: the Tusculan Disputations, the De Natura Deorum, the De Officiis, the De Amicitia, and De Senectute. He wrote it as a dialogue in which the elder statesman Cato, the great-grandfather of the Cato we discussed in an earlier episode, addresses two younger men who have come to ask him how he bears the burdens of old age. Cato's answer is Cicero's answer, and it is built around a single, structurally elegant argument. The complaints against old age, he says, are four. It removes you from active life. It weakens the body. It deprives you of pleasures, and it brings you close to death. He then takes each complaint apart, not to deny the reality behind it, but to show that the grief each complaint carries rests on a misunderstanding of what the later decades are actually for. He died in December of 43 BC, assassinated by agents of Mark Antony, whose political interests Cicero's speeches had opposed. He was 63 years old. He had written De Senectute 14 months before his death. The four complaints and Cicero's answers. Slowly, because each one is doing real philosophical work. The first complaint: old age removes you from active life. You can no longer do what you once did. The arena of your greatest effectiveness is closing. Cicero's answer: the arena changes, it does not close. The activity of old age is different from the activity of youth and middle age, less physical, more interior, more concerned with counsel and reflection, and the transmission of what has been learned. Cato points to the great men of Roman history who did their most consequential work in old age, who governed, advised, judged, and shaped the direction of the Republic precisely because they had the accumulated wisdom of decades to bring. The mind does not decline the way the body does, it deepens. And the person who has spent their life genuinely thinking has, in old age, more to offer than they had at 40, not less. The second complaint: old age weakens the body. Cicero's answer: it does, and the wise person prepares for this in middle age by cultivating the resources that do not require the body's peak performance. The philosopher's pleasures, conversation, reading, thought, the company of good people, the cultivation of the garden do not require strength. They require the specific richness of a life that has been building these capacities for decades. The person who arrives at old age having invested in the life of the mind is not arriving at diminishment, they are arriving at the fullness of what all that investment was for. The third complaint: old age deprives you of pleasure. Cicero's answer is his most provocative. He says, good. Not because pleasure is bad, but because the tyranny of appetites is a form of servitude, and old age, by weakening the appetite for certain pleasures, frees the person from a master they may not have known they had. Cato says he is grateful for the decline of certain desires, because he can now attend, without the competition, to the pleasures that are actually satisfying. The dinner conversation rather than the dinner excess, the book rather than the entertainment, the deepening of friendship rather than the performance of sociability.
This is not asceticism. It is the argument that the pleasures of old age are not lesser pleasures, but different ones, and that the person who approaches them as consolation prizes for the loss of the earlier ones has misread what is on offer. The fourth complaint, and the one that most readers find both the hardest and the most valuable, is death. Old age brings you close to death. How does Cato bear this? He says he is not afraid of it, not from bravado, from philosophy. Drawing on Plato, he argues that the soul's survival after death is either a certainty or an irrelevance. If it survives, there is nothing to fear. If it does not, there will be no one present to experience the absence. And even without the metaphysical argument, he points to the nature of time itself. A life completed, fully inhabited, genuinely lived, arrived at its natural conclusion is not a tragedy, it is an achievement. The fear of death is, in large part, the fear of a life not lived, and the cure for that fear is not more time, it is more life in the time available. Now the bridge. because Cicero was a 1st century BC Roman politician writing in the specific context of the collapse of the republic he loved. But here is what has not changed. The person at 60 who feels the specific vertigo of watching their cultural moment recede. The professional who has spent decades building expertise and begins to notice the younger people moving past. The person who has identified so completely with what they could do that the gradual change in what they can do feels like the loss of themselves. Cicero is not telling you this is not happening. He is telling you that you are using the wrong measure, that the value of this decade is not its resemblance to the previous one, that the things this particular time makes available, the depth of reflection, the freedom from certain competitions, the specific quality of friendship that only long familiarity produces, the ripeness of understanding that decades of genuine thinking provide, are not replacements for what is gone. They are the point, the thing all of it was building toward. He wrote this while his republic collapsed, while his daughter was freshly dead, while the political forces that would eventually kill him were gathering. He was not writing from serenity. He was writing from the conviction that the argument was true and that making it clearly was what he could still do. That is the Cicero practice, not acceptance of decline, the active, philosophically serious claim on what this time is actually for. Here is what Cicero asks of you today.
First, take the inventory of what the later decades have added, not subtracted. Not the qualities you have lost, the qualities that have arrived, that were not available at 30 or 40, that required the accumulation of exactly this many years to develop, the patience that was earned rather than taught, the capacity for the specific quality of friendship that only people who have known each other through difficulty can have, the freedom from the need to prove yourself that the early decades required and that something in the later ones is beginning finally to release. Write them down, not as consolation, as honest inventory, because the person who cannot name what this decade contains that the previous ones did not has not yet made the philosophical shift that Cicero is describing. Second, invest in the pleasures that deepen. Cicero's Cato is specific about this. The pleasures of old age are not found by pursuing the pleasures of youth with diminishing returns. They are found by investing in the things that the earlier decades rarely had time for, and that now, if you choose them, have room to develop. The friendship tended rather than managed, the book read slowly rather than consumed, the garden that produces its rewards on its own unhurried schedule, the conversation that goes somewhere worth going because neither person is watching the clock. Find one investment today in the pleasure that deepens, not the optimization, the ripening. Third, practice the transmission. One of Cicero's most insistent arguments is that the genuine activity of old age is the passing on of what has been learned. Not lecturing, Cato is explicit that the person who forces their experience on unwilling recipients has misunderstood the transaction. The genuine transmission that happens when the younger person asks and the older person answers honestly, from the actual experience rather than the idealized version of it. Find one person, younger or simply earlier in their path, to whom you can offer something real from what you have actually learned. Not wisdom performance, one true thing, given plainly, to someone who would benefit from receiving it. Fourth, make your peace with time. Not resignation. The Cicero practice, the specific, philosophically grounded, genuinely hard practice of relating to the remaining time as what it is, finite, full, and not in need of the kind of defense against its ending that the anxiety of the unexamined life produces.
The fear of death is, for most people, the fear of a life not fully inhabited. Cicero's prescription is not more time. It is the deliberate, gaily, entirely available choice to inhabit this time more fully, so that what is finite is also, in the only sense that the Stoics and Cicero and the examined life have ever agreed on, enough. I want to close with the image that stays with me when I think about Cicero writing De Senectute in 44 BC.
Not the great orator at his peak, not the man who saved the Republic from the Catilinarian conspiracy and was celebrated in the streets of Rome. The man at his villa in Tusculum, 62 years old, his daughter dead, his republic destroyed, his political career effectively over, writing a dialogue about old age as opportunity. Writing it carefully, writing it with the full force of a mind that had been building for 6 decades and that still had, in the 14 months remaining to it, this to give. He could not stop the political catastrophe. He could not bring Tullia back. He could not restore the Republic or prevent his own death. What he could do was think clearly about the thing that most people in his position were either fleeing or despairing over, and write down what the thinking produced. The argument is still here, 44 BC to the present, 2,060 years, still being read, still being returned to by people who are finding in the specific clarity of an old man in a collapsing world something that makes the present moment more navigable. That is what the later decades, used well, can produce, not the continuation of what came before, something that only the accumulation of exactly this much living and exactly this much loss and exactly this much hard-won understanding could have made. Here is the question Cicero leaves us with today. Which of his 4 complaints about old age is costing you the most right now? The sense of removal from active life? The body's complaints? The loss of earlier pleasures? Or the proximity of mortality? And what would his answer to that specific complaint look like in your specific life, not in 1st century BC Rome, but here, in the decade you are actually in, with the specific capacities and losses and ripening that this time has produced? Leave that in the comments, because naming which complaint is yours is the beginning of the philosophical work that Cicero did in his final year, not accepting the decline, refusing it, on the grounds that the decline is only visible as decline from the wrong measure, and choosing, actively, the right one. I'll see you in the next one.